Tiny. That is the word everyone used for Belgium in the summer of 1914. A country you could drive across in an afternoon, with an army a fraction the size of the Colossus next door. And yet for 12 days this tiny nation stopped the most powerful war machine on the planet, dead in its tracks. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. The entire German strategy for winning the First World War rested on speed. Smash through Belgium, swing down into France, capture Paris, and win the war in the West before Russia could fully wake up in the East. Every hour mattered. And the gateway to all of it was one city on the river Meuse, ringed by 12 concrete forts. The Germans expected those forts to fall in a day, maybe 2. They did not fall in a day, they held. The defender, Lieutenant General Gerard Lemon, was handed a single order by his king: hold to the end. When a German officer rode up under a white flag and demanded surrender, Lemon's answer was 3 words: fight your way through. So they tried. And in the trying, the German army unleashed something the world had never seen. A secret weapon so monstrous its own crews half feared it, a howitzer firing, shells the weight of a small car. When one of those shells found the magazine of Fort Lanson, the fort did not surrender. It detonated, vanishing in a column of fire that threw concrete the size of houses into the sky and killed roughly 350 men in a heartbeat. They dug Lemon out of the rubble alive. Barely. The first great battle of the First World War was over, but the 4 or 5 days it stole from the German timetable would echo across the next 4 years. This is the siege that broke the schedule of the most famous war plan in history. To understand why Life mattered so much, you have to understand the gamble the whole German war rested on. Germany in 1914 faced a nightmare it had dreaded for decades: a war on 2 fronts at once. France to the west, Russia to the east. Fight both fully and you lose. So the German General Staff built its entire plan around a single bet. Russia was vast and slow to mobilize. France was close and quick, so strike France first with overwhelming force, knock her out in a matter of weeks, then turn the trains east to deal with the Russians. The trouble was the French border itself, bristling with fortresses, a wall of stone and guns facing east, attacking it head, on would bleed the army white. So the plan reached for a backdoor: sweep the bulk of the army north, through neutral Belgium, around the French defenses, and fall on the French armies from the side and the rear like a closing door. That was the Schlieffen plan, refined over years, and now in the hands of the Chief of the General Staff, General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger. On paper it was elegant. In practice it had one enormous problem standing directly in the doorway. Belgium. Belgium was neutral, her neutrality guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain, and right where the German right wing needed to pour through, on the river Meuse, widely called the most heavily fortified place in Europe. Around it ran a ring of 12 modern forts, 6 on each bank of the river, designed in the 1880s by the brilliant Belgian engineer, General Henri Alexis Brialmont. Buried in earth and concrete, armed with retractable steel turrets, they were built to hold an enemy for weeks. The German plan could not tolerate weeks. And so when Germany declared war on Belgium on the 3rd of August, 1914, the question was no longer whether the Germans would come. It was whether anyone in that little country was actually willing to fight a giant. Most of Europe assumed the answer was no. The man the Germans sent to kick the door open was General Otto von Emmich, and the force handed to him was no ordinary unit. It was a hand-picked assault group, a special task force pulled together for one purpose: a coup de main, a lightning grab of the city and its precious bridges before the defenders could even catch their breath. They called it the Army of the Meuse. 6 brigades of infantry, much of it tough peacetime regulars, rather than raw conscripts, screened by the cavalry of Lieutenant General Georg von der Marwitz, roughly 59,800 men with about 100 guns. Behind them, the whole mass of General Karl von B. Fallow's Second Army, well over 300,000 strong, waited to flood through the gap they would open. Riding along as an observer for the High Command was a staff officer whose name would soon be known across the world, Erich Ludendorff. He had helped draw up the plans for this very operation. Now he was here to watch them work. Facing this avalanche was Gerard Lemon. He commanded the Belgian 3rd Division and the fortress garrisons, somewhere around 36,000 men with 252 guns, and the 12 forts of Brielmont's Ring. The forts looked formidable, and they were. But they carried 2 fatal flaws hidden in their concrete. First, they had been built to withstand shellfire of up to 21 centimeters, because in the 1880s that was the largest gun anyone could imagine dragging into the field. Second, the gaps between the forts, 3 to 5 kilometers of open ground each, were meant to be filled with infantry in trenches. The trenches had barely been started. Lemon knew the danger. He also knew his orders. King Albert I, the soldier, king who would command his army in person through the war to come, had selected Lemon himself and told him plainly to hold the position to the end. So Lemon dug in his men where he could, set his machine, guns to cover the roads, and waited in the dark for an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned him, and that did not believe for 1 second he would put up a real fight. The first contact set the tone for everything that followed. German cavalry pushed forward to the Meuse on the 4th of August and found the river bridges blown, not the welcome of a country rolling over. On the morning of the 5th, a German envoy came under a flag of truce to the governor of Lefebvre and demanded surrender. The reply came back fast and hard, the line that would define the siege. Fight your way through, so they did. That night the German brigades hurled themselves at the eastern forts, Barcan, Fegvenschve, Flyron, Pontis, Chaudfontaine, expecting the garrison to crack. Instead they ran into a buzzsaw, Belgian machine. Guns swept the open ground between the forts and turned neat advancing columns into heaps of dead and wounded. The assault on Fort Barcan was thrown back with heavy losses. All along the line the supremely confident German army. The army that had been told this would be a walkover was bleeding badly and going nowhere. By the end of that first day, every single one of Lefebvre's 12 forts still flew the Belgian flag. This was not in the script. The shock ran all the way up the chain. And it was here, with the infantry assault stalling, that the Germans reached for one of the strangest firsts in the history of war. A Zeppelin, an enormous airship, slid through the darkness over the city and released its bombs onto the streets below. It was the first aerial bombing of a city in human history. 9 civilians were killed. As the airship turned, fort artillery clipped it, and it limped away to an emergency landing. Terror from the sky, and still the forts held. Emick's brilliant coup de main, the surprise grab that was supposed to be over before breakfast, had become exactly what the German plan could not afford, a siege. And the man who would turn that stalled siege on its head was not a general at all. Not yet. He was the observer riding at the back of the column, and he was about to take matters into his own hands. The night of the 6th into the 7th of August is when the whole battle pivots, and it pivots on one man making a decision no one ordered him to make. The 14th Brigade is creeping forward in the blackness, trying to slip through one of those undefended gaps between the forts. At its head, Major General Friedrich von Wussow leads them on. Around 1 o'clock in the morning they push toward the village of Rétine, and the Belgians are waiting. Machine guns rake the road. Men go down in rows, the advance jams. Riding near the rear is Erich Ludendorff, the observer, the man with no command. The column ahead of him simply stops. He rides forward to find out why, and the scene that meets him is chaos. Bodies along the road, a crater. Wussow's orderly standing dazed, holding the general's horse, and the general himself lying dead at the edge of the shell hole. The brigade has lost its commander and is falling apart in the dark. Ludendorff does not hesitate. He takes command on the spot. He rallies the survivors, orders up the field howitzers, and drives the attack forward through brutal house fighting in the village of Q. Du Bois until, around dawn, the village is his. By noon his men stand on high ground, and there below them, across the river, lies the city of Lefebvre itself. smoke rising over the rooftops. He has done the thing the entire assault was designed to do. He has gotten inside the ring of forts. The forts on the heights still stand, untaken, defiant. But the city and the valley between them is suddenly within reach, and with it the bridges over the Meuse that the whole German plan depends on. Lemon, realizing German troops are now loose inside his perimeter, and fearing his infantry will be surrounded, makes a fateful call. He sends the 3rd Division back west to join the main Belgian army, and moves his own command post into Fort Lanson. The forts will fight on, but the city is about to fall. What happens next unfolds in 2 acts, and to understand why Lefebvre delayed an empire, you have to watch both. Act 1 is Ludendorff's bluff. On the 7th of August, with the brigade holding the heights, Ludendorff drives forward ahead of his infantry, ahead of Infantry Regiment 27, under the impression that the old citadel of Lefebvre in the heart of the city has already been captured. It has not. He arrives at the gate of the citadel essentially alone with his driver, and finds himself face to face with the garrison still inside. He does the only thing a man can do in that situation. He pounds on the door and demands their surrender as though an army stands behind him, and the garrison, rattled, cut off, seeing a senior German officer apparently in command of the whole situation, opens the gate and surrenders. With that single piece of theater, Ludendorff holds the city, the heights, and the bridges over the Meuse, most of them intact. For this and for his charge through the forts, he and Emmich would both receive the Pour les Mêmes Faits, the highest German military honor. A legend is born in a single morning. But here is the thing that casual history forgets. Taking the city did not win the battle. B. Faylo now hands the siege operations to General Karl von Einem, and the Germans turn to face the real problem. The 12 forts on the high ground are still there, still manned, still firing. And critically, their guns command the railway lines and roads that the German 2nd and 3rd armies need to pour west into France. As long as those forts spit shells across the tracks, the great wheeling advance, the entire point of the Schlieffen Plan cannot roll forward at full strength. The Germans hold the doorway, but the doorframe is still shooting at them. So Act 2 begins, and it is an act of pure annihilation. The German field guns, the standard heavy artillery, hammer the forts and barely scratch them. Brielmont's concrete, weak as it was, still shrugs off ordinary shells. The infantry assaults that follow are slaughtered against the turrets and the ditches. The Germans have taken the city and still cannot move. The high command grows desperate. The schedule, the precious schedule, is bleeding days. And then, onto the field, comes the monster. It is the 12th of August. A special battery, Kurs Marigny Canon Battery 3, arrives outside Lefebvre, dragging 2 of the most fearsome weapons ever built. The 42-centimeter howitzer, 420 millimeters of barrel, a Krupp creation built in total secrecy for one single purpose: to crack open the very forts of Belgium and France that threatened the German plan. The soldiers give it a nickname that will echo through the whole war: Big Bertha. Each gun hurls a shell weighing around 800 kilograms. A shell fitted with a delay fuse so that it punches through up to 2 meters of concrete before it explodes. Deep inside the fort, among the men, alongside them work borrowed Austro-Hungarian Skoda howitzers of 30.5 centimeters. Nothing Brielmont ever imagined could stand against this. The forts were built to take 21-centimeter fire. They are about to be hit by twice that and more. The first target is Fort Pontis. The great guns open fire on the evening of the 12th, and the effect is apocalyptic. Even a near miss is enough to stun a garrison senseless inside its concrete shell. By around 12:30 on the 13th, after a bombardment of barely 50 rounds, Pontis is wrecked and the white flag goes up. A fort built to hold for a month has been broken in a matter of hours. The battery moves on, and the pattern repeats with terrible efficiency. Fort Layers surrenders before the guns even open fire, the garrison having seen what is coming. One by one, the proud ring of forts is gutted from inside. And then comes Fort Lanson, where Giffard Leman himself has made his command post, refusing every demand to give up. On the 15th of August, the great howitzers turn their fire on it. Shell after shell rains down. The men inside endure the unendurable, the concrete cracking and groaning above them, the air thick with smoke, and the choking fumes of their own black powder guns. They hold. They keep firing back, and then the 25th shell falls. It finds the magazine. What happens in that instant is not a battle anymore. It is a volcano. The fort's entire ammunition store detonates at once, and Fort Lonson simply ceases to exist as a fort. The commandant, Victor Nasons, who lived through it, described what the blast did to the men, the concrete mass torn apart, and most of the garrison crushed under blocks of concrete, burned alive or asphyxiated. Roughly 350 men died in a single moment. The explosion threw slabs of concrete weighing tons across the surrounding ground, where some of them still lie to this day. And in the ruins, the Germans find Giffard Lehmann, not surrendered, knocked unconscious by the blast, half buried, pulled from the wreckage of his own command post, still alive. The story goes that when they revived him, he insisted he had not surrendered, that he had been overcome, that they should record he was taken senseless and not yielding. Whether every word is exact, the spirit is true to the man who said, "Fight your way through," and meant it to the last shell. With Lonson gone, German propaganda did the rest, parading the fort's destruction to shatter the will of the survivors. The last two forts, Holon and FL Femal, gave up on the 16th of August. The ring was broken. Liefde had fallen, but look at the calendar. The 4th of August to the 16th, 12 days. 12 days the German plan was never ever meant to spend. Step back from the guns for a moment and look at the men. The Belgian gunners and infantry who held those forts were not supposed to be there at all. Not in any serious sense. The whole of Europe had assumed Belgium would step aside, that no small country would throw itself in front of the German army. Those men proved otherwise with their bodies. They sat inside concrete boxes filling with the choking gas of their own black powder charges, because most of the forts had no proper ventilation, firing until the air itself became a weapon against them. They held positions designed to be supported by trenches that were never dug, in gaps the enemy poured through in the dark. Think of what it was to be inside Fort Lonson in those final hours. The roof a meter or two of concrete over your head, and falling on it every few minutes, a shell the weight of a small car, fused to drill through the ceiling before it burst among you. No way out. No way to hit back at the guns miles away. Just the weight, and the noise, and the dust, and then the magazine 350 men, gone between one breath and the next, sealed into the rubble that became their tomb. Fort Lonson is a war grave to this day. The dead were never recovered from where they fell. And the Germans paid too. The neat assault columns of the first nights left thousands of their own dead and wounded scattered in the open ground between the forts, cut down by machine. Guns they had been told to expect no resistance from. Estimates of the German cost run from several thousand into far higher figures, the truth blurred by the chaos of those first days of a war nobody yet understood. This was the opening battle of the First World War, the first taste of what industrial firepower did to human flesh, and both sides drank from it. Above the soldiers stood Lehmann, carried off into German captivity, broken in body, his fortress in ruins. From prison in Germany, he wrote to his king a line that holds the whole battle in a single sentence. "I would gladly have given my life, but death would not have me. So who won?" On the map, the Germans plainly. By the 17th of August, the Second Army, with the 1st and 3rd, began the great wheeling advance the forts had held up. Brussels itself fell without a fight on the 20th. The German tide rolled on into France. Liefde was captured, occupied behind the lines. By the cold arithmetic of ground taken, it was a German victory, and the bravest defense in the world had not stopped the invasion. And yet, the cost to the timetable was real, and it was measured. General Karl von B. Falo, the man commanding the army that had to force the gateway, recorded the damage himself. The High Command had hoped to begin the advance toward the French border around the middle of August. The siege pushed that start back to the 17th. The railways the German armies needed through eastern Belgium were closed for the whole length of the siege. German troops did not appear in strength before the next fortress city, Namur, until the 20th of August. The estimate that hardened into history was a delay of 4 to 5 days for the right wing of the German advance. 4 or 5 days. It sounds small. Hold that thought. Because everything that made l'effet matter to the rest of the war lives inside those few stolen days. Here is why a delay of days could shadow a war of years. The entire German plan in the West was a race against the clock. Beat France before Russia is ready, before Britain can land an army, before the French can recover their balance. Every day the German right wing did not move was a day France used to mobilize, to shift troops, to recover from the early disasters along her own frontier. A day Britain's small but professional army used to cross the Channel and take its place on the line. The men who held l'effet did not save Belgium, and they did not save France by themselves, but they handed the Allies time, and in a plan as tight as a watch spring. Time was the one thing the Germans could never make more of. When the German advance was finally halted that September on the River Marne, just short of Paris, in the battle that saved France and doomed Germany to the long war she dreaded, the clock that ran out had started ticking at l'effet. There was a second lesson, harder and colder. L'effet shattered the world's faith in the fortress. For decades, nations had buried their security in concrete rings exactly like Brielmant's. In 12 days, the Big Bertha proved that the age of the fixed fort was ending, that no wall of concrete could outlast a heavy enough gun. Across the border, the French drew the lesson and began stripping the guns from their own great fortress city, Verdun, judging forts no longer worth defending. 2 years later, that same Verdun would become the longest and most terrible battle of the entire war. The shadow of l'effet fell even there. So where does l'effet rank? Be honest first. It was not Verdun, that 10-month furnace that swallowed a generation. It was not the Somme, with its 60,000 casualties in a single day. It was not the Marne, the battle that actually stopped the German advance. Measured in raw scale and bloodshed, l'effet is smaller than the giants that came after it. But rank a battle by what it set in motion, and l'effet stands very tall indeed. It was the first battle of the First World War, the opening blow of a conflict that would remake the world. It was the combat debut of the heavy siege gun, the weapon that ended the era of the fortress. It was the moment a tiny nation expected to surrender, instead chose to fight, and in fighting handed the German war plan a delay it could not afford, and a moral defeat it never expected. France understood exactly what it meant and awarded the city of l'effet the Légion d'honneur in that same year of 1914, an entire nation's highest honor pinned to a single town. The verdict is this: l'effet did not win the war, and it could not have. But of all the small battles that shaped a giant war, few cast a longer shadow. It bent the timetable that the whole German strategy was built on. It cracked the faith of every army in the fortress, and it proved in the very first days that the men defending their own ground would not simply step aside. The German idol, for all its splendor, had shown the world it had feet of clay. 12 days, 12 forts, one king's order to hold to the end, and a general dug alive from the grave of his own fort. That is the price the giant paid just to get through the front door of the war. But the door was open now, and the gray tide was pouring west toward Paris, gathering speed, certain it could still win the war in a single season. Standing in its path was a French army reeling from disaster, and a British force barely off the boats. What happened when that tide finally crashed against them on a quiet river just short of the capital is the battle that decided whether the whole German gamble would pay off. That is the story of the Marne, and that is where we go next.